I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Gadigal people of the Eora Nations and as the traditional owners and custodians of the land on which we're meeting tonight, and to welcome any people of this country or other Indigenous communities with us this evening. I think it is really particularly important to do Welcome to Country when we think about the history and lineage of the Biennale of Sydney and the discussion that we're having here tonight, excavating the archive, and particularly in the context of Artspace. We've had a remarkable history with the Biennale of Sydney that's underpinned by some key numbers, with the Biennale being established, as you know, in 1973, Artspace established in 1983. We were first a satellite venue for the Biennale in 1986. We were an official venue when we were established in this building in 1992. We were an official venue for the Biennale since 1996, and it's been a remarkable partnership. Next year will be our 22nd year with the Sydney Biennale, which I think is fortuitous from a numerology perspective when we think about it being the 22nd Sydney Biennale. We've been pleased to... It is the 22nd, isn't it? 21st. Oh, we're... Okay, 22 is a horrible number in numerology. Such a relief. But look, I will just say that over, the nearly 30 years that we've had a relationship with the Biennale of Sydney, it's been an extraordinary conversation. And in the past 3.5 years, while I've been director at Artspace, it's been an incredible collaboration with the team at the Biennale. And we had a really rewarding and enriching collaboration with them, delivering a series of public programs and a project called the Bureau of Writing, which excavated forms of discursive practice, discourse and responses, the history of Artspace and its critical readers, and its response to engaging in rigorous debate with the ideas that underpin each iteration of the Biennale has been a really important conversation over generations, and we couldn't be more pleased to be able to host this event this evening. So I just want to thank you for joining us at Artspace, and I will hand over to my wonderful colleague, Melissa Ratcliffe, Curator and Manager of Programs and Education at the Biennale of Sydney. Melissa has been an extraordinary collaborator for Artspace and is one of the smartest curators I know in town, so please give her a round of applause.
Well, if I wasn't nervous before that introduction, can I add my warm welcome on behalf of the Biennale? And thanks also to Artspace, who we've been obviously very pleased to work with for many years going back, over 30 years as Alexi mentioned. And I'd like to also acknowledge that where we meet and where the Biennale works and presents its exhibitions is the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and whose culture and sovereignty we hope to better acknowledge every year. And I pay my respects to their elders past, present and future. So it's great to see so many friends here tonight, particularly colleagues from Art Gallery of New South Wales. In November 2015, the Biennale gifted its archive to the National Art Archive, which is housed at the Art Gallery of New South Wales, which celebrates our continuous association going back to 1976. A special hello and thanks to Stephen, Claire and Eric for their support of our ongoing program and the work on the substantial archive. The Biennale Archive is now a part of the largest archive in the country, Art Archive, with the National Art Archive currently holding the histories of over 220 diverse artists working across all media, including Margaret Preston, Max DePayne, Tony Tuxon, Ian Byrne, Richard and Pat Larter, Robert Klippel, Michael Riley and Colin Lansley. I'd like to also thank Transfield Holdings for the financial contribution that has allowed this archive project and series to take place. So we held the first Biennale Archive Stories event in December in the wonderful company of Mike Parr, John Mundine, Paula Latos-Valier and of course Mami Kataoka, whose contributions to the Biennale exhibitions were all numerous and significant. And it was wonderful to talk about that in public. So we'll continue these talks in the lead up to next year's 21st edition, using these conversations to investigate these archive findings and give space to oral histories from the past 40 years. We're also grateful to Mami Kataoka for the initiative to consider our role over time, both in Sydney and the region, as we approach our 45th year of existence. So this second chapter tells stories spanning 1979 to 2014 and takes as its departure point a particular atmosphere in the late 1970s roughly between the Biennale's second and third editions in 76 and 79, which can be read through many letters and accounts from concerned members of the art community in that period, some penned by some of our guests this evening. The Biennale grew up alongside the women's art movement in Australia, set up, I believe, around 1974, following earlier feminist organisation around representation and inequity issues. It is to acknowledge this moment and continuing story that we decided to invite Vivienne Binns and Stephen, Julie Rrap and Deborah Kelly to discuss this history through the lens of their respective associations with the Biennale. Just a few notes to biographies. Vivienne Binns, OAM, is known for the explosion that she made on the Sydney art scene with her exhibition at Waters Gallery in 1976, with showing... Oh, sorry, 67, thank you. 67. I'm just being a bit dyslexic, yeah. Yeah, it's catching tonight, numbers syndrome. With works including Vag Dens and Phallic Monument. Vag Dens going on to be considered an icon of feminist art in this country. Vivienne was one of the founding members of the Sydney women's art movement, if I'm not mistaken, and in general a strong agitator in that 70s and 80s efforts to improve conditions for women artists and artists generally, including those discussions surrounding the 1979 Biennale. Her well-known project, Mother's Memories, Other Memories, from 1979 to 81, was exhibited in the 4th Biennale in 1982. Dr. Anne Stephen is the Senior Curator of the University Art Gallery and Art Collection at the University of Sydney. As an art curator and historian, her work is focused on modernism, contemporary art in Australia, and conceptualism. She has produced exhibitions and publications on the work of Ian Byrne, an association that began in 1977 when she co-edited The Great Divide, a critique of Australian culture under capitalism that included arguments against the international blockbuster type exhibition. With Byrne, with Vivienne Binns and many others, she also contributed to a publication called Sydney Biennale, White Elephant or Red Herring, which collected commentary after that exhibition. To Julie Rrap, a signature artist in Australia in the field of representations of the body, going back to her involvement with body art and performance in the mid-1970s. Her photography, painting, sculpture and video has been included in 4 biennales over 3 decades, 1986, 1988, 1992 and 2008. And she also served on the board of the Biennale from 2004 to 2007. Not only that, but she's contributed to various reviews of the Biennale over the years and was a member of the selection committee that appointed the artistic director, Richard Grayson. Coming more recently into contact with the Biennale is Deborah Kelly. She instigated the collaborative project No Human Being is Illegal, parentheses, in all our glory, for the 19th Biennale in 2014. It's a work that is emblematic of her embrace of art's place in a social, political and civic continuum of activity. Advocating for openness, the work celebrated collectivity and heterogeneity at a time when the individual and institutional implication in Australia's refugee policy was being publicly discussed, with the Biennale at the centre of debates. But before we start, I just need to mention that the talk, as you've probably noticed, is being recorded. That's for archival purposes, but we will be putting the talk on our website. So come and have a word to me if anything that's said tonight should stay in the room. And now, please join me in welcoming 21st Biennale Artistic Director, Mami Kataoka, Chief Curator of Mori Art Museum, to lead a roughly 1-hour conversation and open up to about 20 minutes of questions and discussions at the end. Thank you.
Thank you, Melissa, and thank you, Alexi, for hosting our event. And I just started this series for me to really learn the history of a Biennale. And I started to look at the archives, And I just started to find tremendous resources of the energies of that time. And then I thought about interviewing important figures one-to-one, but maybe I thought it's important that also that I can share those stories with the public. And then also, I think some of you might have seen Biennale 10 times or 20 times, and so you also have these knowledges and experiences. And then I thought it's important, particularly as a 21 edition, it's a coming of age year in Australia, and to be able to look back what you have done in a younger age, and then also to set a next platform. And so we prepared, and Melissa, and then also we also worked together to put some of the images and to run through, and then you're all welcome to comment on, raise your hands, and just start speaking. But particularly for this session about the women artists and movements, I thought it's particularly interesting to see what was happening in Sydney was part of the larger world movement. And this was the march in Sydney on International Women's Day in 1975. And it was a time worldwide, globally, and when women started to speak up and then discussing those issues. So Anne kindly shared us some of the publication. Maybe you can start commenting on these.
Yeah, this was in fact the second Lip magazine, and the cover was designed by Mary Callahan and Angela G. It's actually a three-dimensional work when you open it. But the reason that I sent it was for the article that Barbara Hall had written, because I was still actually in Melbourne. I was teaching at Preston, an art school there, but I was involved with Lip and another publication. And it was really through Lip that I first got the Biennale bug, because Barbara's article, which interviewed 3 of the women in the Biennale, was absolutely fascinating. The interview in particular with Fujiko Nakaya has been something that has stayed with me really ever since then. And if I can just read a very short comment that she made as part of the interview with Barbara. She says, "I am interested in capturing on video what the Biennale is all about in a wider context. For instance, on the opening night, I came out to put the fog on." Her work was the fog work, which all of you must know from Canberra. "But decided I didn't want to compete with the demonstrators. I waited until Fraser got into the museum to put the fog on. Because I thought they had their message they wanted to convey at a certain moment. Afterwards, I put my fog on. It didn't interfere with people's message. It made another environment for them." So what she's signalling is the real crisis that Australian culture was confronting in circa 75, 76. Malcolm Fraser, as you all know, 75, the Kerr's coup. And at the opening, there had been this mass demonstration of people who stood up and turned their backs on Fraser. And
that was in 1976.
Yeah. And Fujiko was doing the fog outside. Yeah.
Fantastic. And particularly, I thought it's interesting that Biennale started in 73, and then 76, the second time was the first time that Biennale happened in art gallery. And then between 76 and 79, there were a tremendous number of discussions among Sydney or Australian art community, and started to question about what is this Biennale? What is this all about? What about this relationship between Australian art and international art and European art? What about percentage of women? And that's something that we are still discussing. And all these questions that I have on myself. So I I needed to hear more about what was the discussion happening already. And maybe you can also continue talking about this publication.
Well, that happened about the same time. The Great Divide, which was a one-off, as the subtitle says, ongoing critique of Australian culture under capitalism, still ongoing. The cover designed by Jeff Stewart. It was co-edited with Charles Merriweather, who actually went on to become one of the Biennale directors in later years. It was in the climate, as I said, of the crisis, and unemployment was really high. A whole lot of cultural initiatives were being closed down, community radio, but at the same time there was a lot of the emergence of the land rights movement was right on the radar, and one of the other aspects that the Great Divide collected was the cultural critique of the international arrival of Biennale-type artists. And Ian Byrne, Nigel Lendon and Terry Smith, one of the articles they wrote for the Great Divide was called "Why Do They Keep On Coming?"
Can I just say that
Yes.
the other thing that was, groundbreaking at that time was the questioning of the nature of the artists who were actually included in the Biennale, and the push to include artists who didn't necessarily fall within the areas of what we might call high art. And I think that's where, in the end, a few years later, my practice came in, you see, which we'll see later. But that was very important at that time.
Maybe, Vivienne, you can tell us a little bit about these discussions among local artists. And there are numbers of meetings in a place called the Waters Gallery.
Yes.
And also building of Sydney University.
Yeah, Waters Gallery. I seem to remember a room just down from Waters Gallery upstairs. Do you remember Garibaldi's that had a big mural of Garibaldi on the, yeah. Well, what can I say? They're like...
How did it started? They started to, let's have a sort of a gathering together and talk about it.
Well, I think it came out of the Art Workers Union, probably, and the discussions that emerged about that. God, look, it's such a damn long time ago. And see, there was concern about, art education and the number of women and how women were treated in art schools and the relationship between women students and their male tutors and so on. But the Art Workers Union, I think that might have been where this turmoil all started to... Can you...
Well, it was actually the Biennale protests out of which the Artworks Union arose because of issues like representation of women artists. Like in the Fujiko interview, I think Barbara says there are 6 women and 80 men.
Yeah.
And those kind of statistical questions were at the forefront. But it was also questions about the representation of Australian artists generally.
That's exactly.
And, questions about fees for artists and contracts. I mean, bread and butter issues, which didn't exist at that stage.
Yeah, I found it quite interesting because when something started urgently, like Biennale of Sydney, and then even after 1973, the Biennale Committee tried to, there was one Japanese women sculptor for the first one, 1973, Minami Tada, and Biennale wanted to leave the sculpture in Sydney, partly to commemorate, but partly that they don't have to ship it back. And so they were writing all these letters to Japanese companies, but nobody said yes. So eventually the sculpture needed to go back to Japan. But I think that was the initial stage of there was no system, no rules, but everyone was questioning about how to do it. and including this idea of fees and all that. And I thought it's quite lively in a way, instead of having all this system already, and then new artists and a new events are just becoming part of the contents of this system.
Maybe I'll make a small. I mean, I was sitting here just remembering that the Biennale. So the Biennales. I think it's a funny thing about. Maybe this is. I don't know how to turn this is, but in terms of how Australian artists are treated in Biennales, or paid in Biennales, is I discovered that in. So I've been in 4, right? But 1992, I was living in Belgium, so I came back from Belgium. So I was sort of an Australian artist living elsewhere. And let me tell you, the fee structure was quite different. So that was very revealing. So I guess that's an ongoing... I mean, I guess we have to be generous about the fact most artists, if you're asked into a Biennale, and you, from wherever you are, I guess, but certainly locally, it's, you know, it's a thrill. It's an exciting and important thing to be part of. So it's not that that's forefront at your mind, but I do remember that as being distinctly different in terms of...
In what way exactly?
Basically, I got a lot more money.
That's the important
And given I made the
thing to
work
say.
out of hair, it didn't cost much, so...
Yeah, and then let's go to... Yeah, this is the cover of 1979 Biennale, European Dialogue, and artistic director was Nick Waterloo, and just in the end, 131 artists, and Australian artists was 20%, 26 Australian artists, and then 22 women, so it's 17%, and 11 Australian women means out of 22 women artists, Australian women were 50%. But there was this important publication or commentary. This was published afterwards, I understand. And Vivienne was among those organizers and contributors.
Well, the stories behind this, and even behind the discussions that we had with Nick Waterloo, you know, they're very revealing in just the same way as what Julie's just talked about, the fees. Now, with those talks, I think Frank Belgiorno-Nettis even came to a meeting or two. Nick certainly came and talked to us quite often. And, you know, I got some very early lessons in how power interacts with the common herd. Because, you know, they were very receptive and listened to what we had to say and so on, and even at times agreed and seemed to be making agreements to things that they might be doing, and then they'd go off and do whatever they wanted to. And, you know, that was very outstanding, but there was a change in, you know, by the time the 82, there was this shift, and I always felt that, you know, that other strategy that power uses to bring the dissidents on side is that, you know, you invite them inside the tent. So, you know, there are a few people, I think probably, maybe I'm doing a disservice, you know, I'll say that, but it seemed to me that inviting me with the kind of work that I was involved in into the Biennale at that time was just that kind of strategy. But again, if you follow on and watch later Biennales and how art practice has changed over the years, so many things that we were talking about, collaborations and people who weren't from outside the mainstream art, all of that stuff and the sort of stuff that I was doing, working with people who were amateurs, and that's become integrated into art practice in so many ways now. You know, I look around and all the things that I was doing back whenever that was radical has now become commonplace now, is what I sort of find.
Yeah, I can say that before you reached to this moment of 1979, there was a number of meetings held starting even early 1977. So there were actually good enough 2 years and over the course of time, and different artist group are meeting, and then also, as you said, you invited Franco Belgiano Nettis, and Alwyn Lin, Leon Parisien, Peter Loverty, and Tony Winter, both of them.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting that quite practically speaking, that there had been also quite proper letters signed by more than 10 artists that are lining up all these requests of want to have 50% of Australian artists, and if it's a matter of budget, and you should reduce the number of European artists to invite, because it must have been cost fortune, much expensive than now, and to include the equal number of Australian artists. So yeah, I just wanted to hear how was the sort of discussion.
There was a lot of tension also around the push for greater representation of women. And even though, you know, there were a number of the men who were on side, nonetheless, I was out actually in the country before this magazine was set up. And while I was away, there was this attempt to get a better representation for women. And when I came back, the women were all somewhat traumatised because it had been such a horrible experience, and in fact they'd come to be very mistrustful of even the male friends that were involved in it, because they felt that they really hadn't in the end supported them. And so I was advised against having anything to do with this publication. I nonetheless felt that it was very important that a woman's voice be there. And it wasn't that this wasn't all amongst friends and colleagues. I mean, it was tensions deeply revealing the nature of gender and so on, especially at that time. But there was the period of preparing that magazine. I don't know how long it was, maybe 3 months or so, when I distinctly was out of favour with my women friends and colleagues. The minute it was over, closed back in and we were all friends again. But that, I mean, that is a sign of the tensions. I mean, honestly, when I say that the women were traumatised, they didn't want, I mean, they just didn't want to go on. They really didn't want to have anything more to do, and they felt, you know, that there had been some betrayal, great tension in any case. And I think that's really important to understand, because, you know, no Biennale is without its great tensions, and, you know, anyone who's had anything to do with it and the nature of the type, you know, the artists are involved and the politics and so on, you know, it's pretty rich stuff, and it's not always nice.
But do you think those discussions on the basis of having for the coming Biennale in 1979, that you had platform or opportunities to discuss among the local artists as well as all these people from the Biennale committee?
You've got that period in the 79, 80 and so on, I was deeply involved in this project of Mother's Memories, which took me out of the active circus, and it took over my life. And even that first one was at University of New South Wales, and then I went to Blacktown, and then after that I had a project that was in the central west of New South Wales. So that's partly why I think I can't remember a lot of things, and I rely on people who were there all the time.
Anne also contributed.
Well, I came up to Sydney, but there are probably people who are far more involved in the discussion amongst the audience than I was. I mean, it was fairly anarchic too. I mean, Vivienne's right to describe the tensions, because there were tensions. I mean, clearly, you know, the debate about content. I mean, the great thing about Biennales is the sense of being engaged with a global culture, global cultures, and the sense of the isolation of Australia from other cultures. So, you know, it was something that, you know, was deeply invested in on the one hand, wanting to see more of what was going on in the world, but also wanting to see our own artists as part of that world. So that, you know, there were profound tensions. I think Vivienne's quite right, let alone the questions around gender. Indeed.
My understanding about this Australian artist ratio, it's the Nick Waterloo reflecting on the 1979 Biennale, partly as a result of all this. A year later, in 1980, the first national survey of recent Australian art, Perspecta, took place. And I was reading this, and it's interesting that the national started, and while Perspecta lasted, I think it was like 10 years or so, and then starting again, and then it's also giving me the new question of how we see the national, also the role of Biennale again.
Perspective was amazing. I mean, it was the first time that we had an exhibition that showed a range of artists from all over Australia. I mean, even now, you know, if you're a Melbourne artist, Sydney artist, Western Australian artist, you don't necessarily know what's going on in other states, but Perspective really brought to the fore. I found it really enlivening, and, you know, it's terrific.
But do you think Perspective somehow satisfied some of the desire for Australian artists to be presented more in a sort of larger scale? Maybe Deborah or...
I wasn't living in Sydney at that time, and in fact I wasn't even really involved in the art world. I was running a nightclub, being a DJ.
That's a good alternative.
Have you seen any of the Prospecta?
No, I didn't live here then, and I wasn't rich enough to be taking myself to another city just to see an art show.
You were in a younger generation.
Little bit.
Well, I mean, I think Perspecta, and I think a lot of people here who probably were in Perspecta thought they were really important. They were a fantastic alternative to the Biennale, which goes without saying is also really important. And I think that's what the National's trying to do. And I mean, I haven't seen all of it yet, but it is fantastic. I mean, you know, the question of Australian identity in these things, I think when you do a national show, which Perspecta was, allowed us to look at ourselves, because it's always this ongoing question, what is Australian art, you know? I mean, it's not such a stupid question, because if you think about, you know, when I lived in Europe, if you talked about Belgian art or French art, or, you know, people didn't sort of turn their nose up. People understood deeply, because of a long history, what those differences were. And I think we're still reflecting on that. So in that sense, I think the National is a really important revival of what Perspecta did. The MCA did, they did have some of you might remember that, it was brought up at an artist advisory committee that Perspecta should return. And so if some of you may remember, they've sort of stopped it now because I guess the National's taken that place, but they were doing a kind of every alternate year, more or less, to the Biennale, they would do, I guess, an exhibition, you know, of that broad category of mid-career artists who often starve in the desert for a very long time, as we all know. I seem to have moved into even a more difficult category now, which is called senior artists, which I wasn't aware. It's really strange. I don't know what happens then. I guess you starve even more. But anyway, there should be a seniors card that goes with it, I think. But anyway, but I think, you know, that those shows, in whatever form they take, are really important. And I think they're a great counterbalance to the Biennale, which is the opportunity for Australian artists to have their work alongside artists from wherever. And we mustn't forget, you know, that a lot of artists from other countries loved coming to the Sydney Biennale. I mean, it was a lot of fun. I actually remember more the ones I wasn't in. They were a bit wilder in the beginning, I think. You had the sort of Jürgen Klaukes and the kind of crazy Germans. I mean, I have funny stories of remembering Immendorf walking along. He was staying at Bondi, but he never got out of his black leathers and his silver jewellery, which was quite a sight to see on a hot day in Bondi. But, you know, I think all of us have got these really, as I said to Rosin earlier, there's some stories I can't repeat here. But, I mean, I don't know, that's the fun of a Biennale, because it's about the work, and that's the serious side of it, but it's also about people. I mean, in the 1992 Biennale, I met Lily de Jury, as we discovered, and Joost de Klerk, and I went and lived in Belgium for 5 years. So people, you know, it is a network. You meet people in these really wonderful ways, and it's in the atmosphere of making art, setting up shows, you know, setting up your work for a show. And I don't know, that was for me a fantastic opportunity that we could reach out to the rest of the world and that there was real interest in what was going on here.
Yeah.
I mean, think of Marina
Deborah,
and Ule. I mean, Marina's had a very big, Marina's had a very big, you know, she's played a role here. So they
she
came
came
out of
in
Biennales.
1979,
Yeah,
yes. Yeah.
exactly.
And then traveled around the
Yeah,
country.
it's good to remember that.
Yeah. Deborah, you wanted to comment on something?
I just wanted to say that I kind of came into the art world in the absence of perspective, and its absence was really keenly felt, I think, by the, I'm sorry about my stupid donkey voice, by the way, by becoming an artist in an art world which was so totally Sydney only or Melbourne only, pretty well. And Melbourne and Sydney might as well have been as far away as Melbourne and London. There's just no communication. And I really hope that the National changes that for us, for our art world, so that we have more exchange and more knowledge of what each other is doing.
But I think that's what Perspective did. I think it
Exactly,
brought
that's what
people
I'm
from all
saying.
around.
It
But
wasn't
Biennales
there.
do that too, because I mean, artists come from Perth or you know wherever they're living.
Just wanted to go back to this women issue. And this is from 1979, the Nick Waterloo. The more women should have a place. And this was one of the media clipping. But when we can look at this one by Daniel Buren, and he's the important artist from France. And he said, I like seeing so many women's artwork amongst the Australian part. It was very surprising for me to see that the female artists could get their demands through and participation with 50%. This never happened in Europe.
And it only happened in Australia once. Don't get too excited.
Yeah, but I actually think that women artists in Australia were doing something quite phenomenal. When I lived in Europe, I mean, people that, you know, people now know, like Pipolotti Riss, for example, these artists weren't being taken up at that time. You know, it was in some ways not easier here, but I think women pushed something really hard here. And I think, you know, even that whole thing about numbers, which is a kind of maybe crude way of talking about it, but it was a necessary way of doing it. And it actually, by forcing that issue, it made curators go into women's studios and look at their work. Because
Which
it wasn't
was part of
actually
what we
being
did.
looked at, was it? I mean,
No,
it
that was part of what we did. But the other thing that was really important about that period and the women's art movement was that we really went out of the way to make connection with women artists from other cities, capital cities, and when we were able to, we travelled around the country, so there was really close connections between Sydney, Melbourne and Adelaide in particular, but Tasmania too. Not so much Queensland, I think, but also with Perth and Western Australia. So that all kind of frizzled away once the 80s hit. And, you know, there's that big backlash against all that sort of sharing and getting around with each other, and back to the individual artist and, you know, the canon and the rest of it. But that was very outstanding. It was tremendously stimulating, and it wasn't only making contact with women who were practicing as artists, but women, you know, we were also, of course, as you know, looking at women in general and how art ended their lives and what it was that, you know, women had done over the years. And, you know, of course, we came to regard the Museum of Women's Art as being the linen press. And, but it was all these links, you know, like a giant sort of network of links that were stimulated.
Was it, how did it continue? Was this the voice of the women artists for the Biennale or art world Was this 79 was sort of a peak or highest, or did it continue, or what was the feeling?
Well, it was really a network based on publications, exhibitions, and other forms of organised activity. I mean, the Women's Art Network had a great strength in Melbourne. The Lip magazine was published for about 15, 20 years. I mean, that generation has come through. Vivienne and myself are of that generation, and I, as you were talking about the kind of Sydney, Melbourne, Adelaide nexus, I mean, that was definitely part of my sense of entering different art worlds in a way that I hadn't previously. So it was very exciting, and, you know, whether it was in Sydney based at the Tin Sheds or Adelaide at the Experimental Art Foundation, there were a number of informal and semi-fringe support structures that it was formed through. And, you know, there were women's film festivals, etc.
Yes, well, I remember, you know, you learnt that these groups that were formed, social activist groups, they usually have a lifespan of 2 to 3 years or something like that, and they just, you know, people go their own ways or something, but that's it. But where things went on was where there's some sort of funding. So the Women's Art Register, which started in Sydney with Barbara Hall and a group of women around, you know, John Grounds and people who were part of the women's art movement, and then it was taken up in Melbourne and other places, but Melbourne, we applied for a grant to continue it, and we got a projector. But Melbourne applied, and they got what was then, you know, what was it, the Schools Commission, a really decent amount of funding that enabled them to set it up and make the foundation of something that still continues today.
Was there any international exchange between, for instance, feminism group in other countries like United States?
Well, the big moment was Lucy Lippard, who came out to Australia as part of the Power lecture series in 1975, and she did studio visits, and she spoke, you know, she gave the Power lecture, was actually not about feminism at all. It was about environmental art or public art of various forms. But she did speak about the West-East bag, which was a kind of women's art registry, and they were women's only discussions, and she had a profound impact on many, many artists.
I can tell you the climate noticeably changed. I was involved and did some work with the Australia Council, but she came out and she said to the organisers of the Power lecture that she didn't want to go to cocktail parties and meet a lot of, you know, regular people in the arts and so on. She wanted to meet women artists, women involved, and she's very firm about that. And I can tell you the difference. I think we'd had, oh God, now I'm going to forget his name. Very famous critic, writer for the abstract hard edge. Clement Greenberg, thank you very much, had come out and done the previous talk. Now, you know, I and other women artists didn't even smell him, you know, like we weren't anywhere, you know, as far as, and not even thought of. But when Lucy came, all of a sudden he was this person who was significant in the as an art critic and writer and so on, and coming to Australia, she only wanted to speak to women artists, and it was astounding. And, you know, I went into the Australia Council and the Visual Arts Board, and I can tell you that all of a sudden there was this interest in women artists. It was extraordinary. So, you know, there's the example of you know, the catalyst coming in from overseas, but it was amazing.
Can I make a little historical note? At that time, I was a schoolgirl, ardently studying art, the art of European white men exclusively. And then I went to university thinking it would be different, and I studied 20th century art, 1980, and we studied white European men exclusively for the entire course. And so I didn't even know women could be artists. I didn't know Australians could be artists.
It's not all changed, you know.
Let's look at 1982, that Vivienne participated, exhibit the version of her artist in community project, Mother's Memories, Others' Memories. Can you talk about your work?
How long have you got? Now, what was exhibited was the work of the participants. There was some work that I'd done. Do people here know about Mother's Memories, Others' Memories? I know some of you will. Don't know what. Well, it was. Where do I start? It actually came out of a lot of things for me, community artwork that I'd done before, but also it was about this business of women's lives and women's history, and where was women's history? And essentially, it's not in the history books because women didn't occupy the public sphere. They were in the domestic sphere, and that wasn't really recorded in the history books. Of course, so where was it? We had to go and talk to our mothers and grandmothers and so on. And I started this work with a friend. We were working with our own mothers and looking at the family album and talking about. And I decided that it was much bigger, and so applied for grants, and I got a residency at the University of New South Wales for a year. They wanted some kind of a project that involved the community and so on, and so in that year I worked with students, staff and some people from outside, and the focus was on women that were important to the participants and their lives, and what place the arts had in their lives and so on. And the idea was that whatever their skills or otherwise, they started from where they were at. So if the only presentation that they understood was a presentation that they'd done at school, well, it started with that. If they were, we did have some painters, and had some, you know, Helen Grace is here. Helen was involved in that project, and so she worked from her point of view, and other people who were, you know, there were painters of one kind or another, Jan Mackay, I won't, you know, go on, but lots of people were involved. And then it was so unbelievably successful, and can I just tell you, I mean, how was it successful? Now, we set up this, people did these display boards that had family photographs, and there is also, I haven't been watching what's been coming up.
This one?
Oh, no, it's all right. But there was some amazing embroidery and stitchery and things, you know, from the bottom drawer and so on. And but people from around Sydney, and I'm sure some of you here quite possibly came to those early exhibitions at University of New South Wales, and I was quite shocked because people would come in and say, "Oh, hi Vivienne, how are you going? Good, how are you going?" And they'd come out and and say to me, "I'll have to go and talk to my mother." And you know, that it struck right at the heartstrings, you know, right at personal realities that wasn't really usual in the way that, you know, that occurred in the arts. It wasn't abstracted, it was raw often, and it wasn't even going deeply into the background, but there was enough there that absolutely, would floor people that came through. And so I then was invited out to Blacktown and did a couple of years out at Blacktown, and we had a lot of exhibitions at Waters Gallery, and this was the final exhibition out at West Point Shopping Centre in Blacktown.
And then you showed in 82 Biennale. So this is from...
So what I showed then was, by that time I was out in central New South Wales doing the next big community project, and but I got together and I did it by showing I had 2 carousels of slides, and I had a couple of the where you can see the shadow of the the postcard work, which were steel enamel slides, which is I taught the students how to do participants how to do this, and they used their family images on the slides, and one of those is in the National Gallery now. So I had those 2 along with. So it was a very un-Biennale, a very un-Biennale kind of thing, and not least because of the way it was displayed. It was much more like a little documentary show, but because of the type of work that the participants did. But I can tell you, for me, and I'll stop because this is very difficult for me. This was I could go on forever. But one of the things that I was able to watch was in the making of the silk screen enamel postcards, because of the nature of the technique and the need to fire in between screening, and I was able to watch how participants worked with images from their family album. And there were some who were deliberately experimental, but there are others where, the image would break up in certain ways because of the actual process itself. But in that breaking up, that was also deeply part of their own exploration of these relationships, and that's why people came in. They wanted to get closer to their grandmother, or break down, and sometimes that couldn't happen because there may have been traumas of divorces, or also, and the mother or grandmother would close up and maybe say, this is for you but not for your project, and some people didn't want to have anything of their lives in public at all. So it's a very extraordinary project, actually.
Sounds very, very exciting. And we go on to the 1984 5th Biennale, and artistic director Léon Parisien, and a protest took place at the opening. And maybe someone could also mention about this.
Were you there, Anne?
No, I was AWOL. I can't remember why.
Who was here? Now, I know Catherine was... Right, so I want to get the names of everybody. I think...
Yeah, if any of you could explain about this protest.
What was the protest?
Women represent...
Wait.
In part, it was organised by the Affirmative Action Committee of the Art Workers Union.
Yeah, Catherine, tell us about it. You were involved in the... You don't remember?
On the left.
You see?
Oh, and
It was about the fairly inadequate representation of women artists in that show. And the garbage bags was... It shows you the DIY activist aesthetic that was prevalent at the time. Yep. It was silence, the Biennale's theme was silence symbol, social metaphor, right? Silence symbol. Yeah. So we just shifted the Biennale's, the title for our own sort of slightly daggy slogan.
So is someone making a list of the women who are... You were looking for them.
We made some efforts, but I realised that I was following in the footsteps of a few others who were also in this room who weren't also entirely successful in identifying everybody. We've got a tentative list here.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, if anyone knows who's in the picture, you can talk to Melissa afterwards. She's trying to track down who they are.
I think I've asked everybody already.
All right, and then we'll go on to 1986, Nick Waterloo's second Biennale, Origin, Originality plus Beyond. And Julie Rrap was in the Biennale.
Oh yes, sorry, I'm back. Just to, I guess, pull on that theme, because we're talking, I guess, obviously about women being represented in biennales, numbers, etc. But I do remember at this time there was someone organised one of those endless, the forums that they have often around, at that time around biennales. And I was saying to Mami, it reminded me, because Miriam Khan was in that biennale. I don't know if any of you remember this. And they had this event, I think it was at the National Art School, and she'd sort of fired me up. She's fiery. Because one thing we'd noticed, even though we were in the Biennale, we didn't think that all the women had been positioned that well. Fortunately, not being that smart, but just I wanted to make a work that needed its own room, which was turned out to be a very good idea, because I had quite a good space. But we sort of identified, why are there more women near the toilets? Anyway, she went through, and it was it was sort of funny, but I have to say it went down like a lead balloon. It wasn't well received. It was by the other artists, but it was that thing, I think, that as an artist invited into something like that, there was this weird, it's not that you're not thrilled and delighted to be in it, but you don't have to be grateful to be in it. And I think that's a word I always remind myself. We don't have to be grateful about being in these things. And that was the sort of message that came back to us. I won't name names, but I was sort of told, you will never be in a Biennale again. I was in 3 more after that, so it didn't matter.
Gee,
people's memories are short.
Me back,
Must have been
She was
fiery
in
enough.
it for 4 times, and
but it is, it's more to the point that it's interesting when artists want to speak out about things that they think are really important. There's always this sense that you will be victimised, at some other point in time. But let me tell you, I think it's really important that we do, because we are the core of all of this. We make the work, and I don't know, I just think that's a really central thing to make a comment about. So, I mean, those things, I was sort of young and naive at that time, and I was a bit, it was sort of exciting to be a bit defiant like that and to speak out. But in fact, the issues were important. And it was that feeling that just because you were in it didn't mean you didn't have a sort of equal discussion about the nature of what you were doing and the sort of spaces that were required. And, there was some sort of, I can't remember his name now. I think, the French artist Bertrand Lavier, who was sort of throwing tantrums right, left and centre because he didn't have a big enough space. And it was like this kind of muscling up to what you needed. And that, as a sort of my first introduction to a Biennale, I was quite sort of, thrown by those sorts of discussions that were going on.
Can you tell us about your work?
This I can barely remember the word.
Break and Enter.
Well, as you saw, it was called Break and Enter. So I had this room constructed that had a very narrow entrance. So unless you're an incredibly thin person, you couldn't actually walk straight through the door. You had to go in sideways. So I guess I was sort of physically talking about people having to break into this space. And of course, once you're in the space, I had, because that's how I was working in those days, a lot of these sort of appropriated images that I re-performed in. That's about as much as I remember about that work.
Nature,
I think it lives in Perth now, and actually one of the curators quite recently told me that she wanted to put it on. Of course, they never ever showed it again in that configuration. It's another problem of installation.
So
they
this
kind of
was
stretched
like
it all out along a
inside.
wall.
Yeah, this is inside.
Yeah,
of
that
your-
was the inside, which I haven't seen in years. But yeah, so it was like my own little museum stroke cave, I guess. Sorry, guys, it's a long time ago. Can't remember. But all I do remember is recently I was told, oh, we can't hang those works anymore. I think they're curling up. So I was like, oh, God.
But you continued in 1988, the following Biennale, and showed other works.
Yeah, so that was interesting too, because I remember, so it was Nick who did that, Nick Waterlow. He said to me, because I'd spent a few years sort of re-performing these famous artworks, and he said to me something like, oh, you've never hopped into a Bonnard or something, and I'm like, right, that's it. I'm never going to do that again. And so it was sort of funny because I had these works that you can see that were these appropriations, or me posing in these famous paintings. I won't go on about the details of how I made it, but at the same time I had the piece down at the wharf, which I guess is the next one.
These are detailed, and this is the one.
So at the same time I had this work, and I don't know if we're even using that venue anymore, but one of the great things about the Biennale, because you talked about venues like the Art Gallery and the MCA, was over the years we've had, you know, the Wharf, the Bond Store, and now of course Cockatoo Island, and I reckon they've sort of provided fantastic opportunities for artists, because with this space, for example, when I was asked to do something there, I wandered around, and the thing that I really noticed was those beautiful wooden pillars, and so I created. Actually, if we go back one, only because it shows you more clearly. So what I did was make these 100 faces of women. I'm not in them. And this was like I call it like the hinge work that sort of allowed me to escape from doing all those works where I was jumping in and out of paintings. So I didn't want that to become, that's all I did. And so for me, transpositions was this work where I took, and actually it was hard to find, 100 faces of women from the history of art right up to the edge of sort of abstraction that were actually looking out at the viewer. And so I found this, I call them like my little army of women who was sort of actually engaging with the gaze of the viewer. And so I decided, because of the structure of the wharf, that instead of making them, I mean, I later showed them as just one big wall of 100 faces. But in that installation, I just picked 10 columns. So if you think about it, they were like supporting the entire structure of the building.
Interesting.
Yeah, and that's why I printed them on wood, obviously. So they were sort of, I don't know if any of you remember that work, but they sort of emerged out of the beam. So it was this thing of being visible and invisible at the same time, which I think when you look at those paintings, and the funny thing about that work, even when you look at it as one big solid 100 faces, people do all that thing of, oh, isn't that such and such as, you know, the painter, blah, blah, and then they start to they can't get it all right, they can't remember which male painter's work it belonged to, and then they start looking at the women who probably inevitably, when I did my research, were mistresses or whatever. And so that was the point of that work, that you forgot who the master was of the painting and you started to look at the women who were the subjects of the painting.
And then I understand that this version of the Biennale travelled to Melbourne.
Yeah, I'd forgotten that.
This
I'd
is the
forgotten
travelled
that
version
detail.
of your installation.
Philosophies of the
from
boudoir.
NGV.
Yeah, I'd forgotten that.
Yeah, because this was let me go back to the cover of the catalogue. It was called Australian Biennale instead of a Biennale of Sydney, because it was commemorating.
So did it only have the Australian artists from that Biennale, presumably?
I think the artists were international.
I can't even remember that happening.
Yeah, but this was the time that it was called Australian Biennale. Then, yes.
That's right, 1988, yeah.
Then, yeah, we can go on to the slides that Anne sent us.
Yeah, it's what Julie was referring to, the stepping out of the temple into the various really wonderful sites, warehouses around Sydney, and I think probably the Bond Store was the all-time great
That was a fantastic
installation. And for those of you who remember that, I think it was about 5 stories. It was just that sense of which René Bloch, who was the director, really for the first time brought a deep sense of history to the Biennale. He made really the history of the ready-made a central part of the Biennale, and he reconstructed a whole series of works. So you'd have Jackie Redgate's remarkable 5-part work, and then around the corner there was Ian Byrne, who did the reconstruction of his very early soft tape with Mel Ramsden, and then around the corner was John Cage, 33 1/3, with the records, and then downstairs, you know, there was Milan Knizak, the Czech artist, doing that room, so that there was this, I mean, he was obviously, you know, the most European of Biennale directors, but with this fantastic sense of the history of the avant-garde. And I think for me that was a huge moment of thinking that Australia had, for the first time, really opened up its, to see contemporary Australian artists sitting side by side with that really seminal avant-garde, those histories.
Yeah, because René Bloch had been coming out here in many previous biennales because he was the commissioner for German, for the German participants. So he came out here a lot. So he had a quite deep knowledge, didn't he, of what Australian artists were doing, you know. So, yeah, I think that was a really... I was away at that time, but I heard it was a fantastic biennale.
Do you remember this one?
What year is this?
1990.
And it was the end of, you know, really the 20th century, the Berlin Wall, and so you had works about the end of the Berlin Wall. You had a lot of German artists with René Bloch, Richter, Polka, you know, for the first time really seeing major painters like them was extraordinary in Sydney.
Yeah, I must have gone to it, but, you know, I've moved around a bit and I haven't been the firmest adherent of, you know, biennales.
And the next one was directed by Tony Bond, 90-93, and then Julie was participating.
Well, this is when I was the European artist coming back to Australia.
Okay.
Yeah.
But it was very much at the kind of post-colonial turn with, you know, Tony deliberately using that...
The Boundary Rider.
Boundary Rider.
That was a good... I reckon that was a really good title, though.
Yeah, remember that. Remember that.
Did you think that our Australian art scene had some changes after you came back?
Well, I came back to live here again in 94. So, yeah, I did actually. Well, I guess it was sort of the time of Keating and it seemed an optimistic time. But that venue, the Bond Store, I'd always hoped we'd get that as a permanent venue for the Biennale, but we didn't. But
does building still exist? I've never been.
I don't know. What's happened to the Bond Store? I have no idea. Probably been developed. Yeah, it was exciting. I mean, and I guess because you had to work with that space physically, people did some really interesting interventions.
And there were a lot of collaborations in that exhibition. In the Bond Store, I remember Campfire Group, which suddenly,
that's right. They were
you know,
fantastic.
Brisbane urban Aboriginal culture, Richard Bell, et al.
Yeah.
With that amazing...
What was that? There was an American border group. I can't remember, Mexican...
And then also
the Border Workshop.
They were fantastic.
And the Anne Mosey, Dolly Nampijimpa collaboration, which was like a reconstruction of a campsite.
Oh yeah, that was incredible. Yeah.
And, you know, their collaborations, in this case, between an international artist, Adrian Piper, North American, Afro-American artist, and Brenda Croft, and that was in the Art Gallery of New South Wales. It was conference call. It was amazing. It was like you stepped into what looked like a foyer with telephones. You pick up the telephone and there'd be a particular how to speak words in a particular Indigenous language, and Brenda's photos were on each of the 4 interior walls. So it was very confronting. And outside, before you stepped in, there was a very long documentation of their communication, because it had been a construction really from, I think it was faxes before the age of
Must be.
internet.
Email, yeah. But I think those role of non-institutional spaces, non-white cube spaces, are one of the dynamic experiences of the Biennale type of the show. And then I think since Caroline Christophe Bakarigiev started to use the Cockatoo Island, I think the island is playing that role now, and especially for the general public who are not so familiar with the museum experience. But if they go to the Cockatoo Island, it's just extraordinary space. And then also the accumulated history of the site and everything, which is so fascinating. So
I should say that I was on the board of the Biennale at that time, and we all got taken out by a boat to see that space, and so we were all really excited. I mean, I've always hoped that would be the only space for the Biennale myself. I think sometimes it gets a bit underutilised, and I think that probably that first one that she did there was quite extraordinary, because it really, a lot of it got used. And I mean, maybe because it was the first time, it was so thrilling. But I even think the fact, when you think about Sydney and the sort of geography of Sydney, there's something really exciting that this island is where you go to see a Biennale, and you have to take a ferry there and so on and so forth. I mean, it's probably not the easiest. I've not done anything there, but it's probably not the easiest site to set up in. But I think...
I heard it's very expensive.
I'm sure there's a few people here. I know that artists go and sort of camp out there and stuff like that. But I don't know, I sort of think... I mean, it's wonderful to... I mean, some work is suited within those more conventional museum sites, but I think we, as Australian artists, because I know when I lived in Europe, artists get, in a way, a lot more opportunities, because there's a lot more there, obviously, to make work in sites that are not the more conventional sites. And I think that's what Cockatoo Island really offers you, and it's you know, it gives you a chance to sort of stretch yourself a bit, so...
Yeah, I think one of the exciting but also very expensive site to install the works. And I want to just jump to 2014 when Deborah Kelly was part of it. And earlier you said you didn't know even that a woman could be an artist. But after some decades, and you, how did you hear all these conversations today of women's participation and all these sort of, from a younger generation?
The thing that really resonates is Vivienne talking about the trauma, actually, of activism, because does anybody not know what happened? Like, is there anybody that needs to know, needs to be explained what happened around the 2014 Biennale? So I just can fast forward to telling you it was unbelievably traumatic for everybody. I mean, let alone the people who remain in indefinite detention offshore, which is so despicable and disgraceful and unbearable. So, and everyone who lives here of goodwill, I think, feels so covered in grief and rage that this is happening around us and because of us, and that we cannot stop it, whatever we do. The fact that the Biennale became kind of emblematic of our implication in this human disgrace, it was so unbearable. And I don't want to talk about the specifics, and there's plenty of things that probably can never be spoken of. except to say that even among the artists organising around the boycott, and I was one of them, it was hard to trust each other, and everybody was in such a lot of pain, actually. It was really a very, very extraordinarily painful backdrop for the actual work I was making, which was before any of this had happened or the links had been drawn. It was specifically counter to the subjectivity that allows that regime to continue. So that was very difficult, impossible. It was impossible. It was like living through impossible days. Every day I cried. A lot of us cried. It was so awful to be failing to actually participate in the bigger world of politics, to be, trying so hard to say something and to be so pathetic, and to nevertheless be attempting to make this totally utopian work in a utopian way, with all these wonderful, incredible subjects of the portraits, as well as the very powerfully creative collaborators, at least one of whom is here. Amanda Holt is here. Oh, and Kat also participated in making it.
Would you like to talk about your works?
Yeah. So what I'm saying is the work was the collaboration. So there are some of the people here who made the collaboration with me. The works end up being something. It's it has an object, but the thing we were making was a utopia in the middle of a nightmare. So it was a very pointy and sharp dilemma. The works themselves, I don't know if people saw them, they are 20 life-sized portraits of people who volunteered themselves, and they were worked on in a workshop situation by 47 people participated, making collage which articulated the ideas that the people in the portraits had brought to us. So sometimes they came and told us stories, sometimes they came and sang to us, or sent us poetry, or stories, or sent proxies. Some people just sent us playlists of music. So, and together, this is, here you can see Amanda right in the middle. There she is. This is, we were trying to learn to make decisions together, to become a cooperative. And we, in fact, turned into this incredibly powerful collaborating team, working for 9 months together, 3 to 7 workshops every single week for 9 months, which just turned into our lives, really. And it was even inside that storm, it was like a heaven. It was a little heaven that we made together. And the work, by the way, has an ongoing life, and it's touring around Australia, thankfully, until the middle of 2018, I think. And I say thankfully because while I've been trying to dematerialize my art practice, I accidentally made a work as big as 20 doors.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. And I think it's been so inspiring for me to think that all these threads of negotiations and efforts and the contribution of an artist like you had been part of that very long history of a Biennale. And one of the reasons that I wanted to look at this history was because I started to learn that there was long history, and then every time there was some sort of argument or discussions, but Biennale was the platform for something. So not only looking at the specific incident from 2014, I wanted to look at from the larger, longer perspective, and also wanted to really acknowledge the earlier efforts of the Bergiano-Nettis family, how hard it was to really continue and bring the efforts of the keeping a Biennale until 20 times and 21st times. So yeah, I thought it's important to look at things from much larger perspective rather than just pointing out one incident. And but I think your comments and stories so rich and contributing for me so much to understand the history of Biennale from a much bigger perspective. And I think we have maybe 10 minutes or so to have some of your questions for these distinguished speakers. Or anything you wanted to add, or different stories, or...
I actually just wanted to mention 3 names that haven't been brought up, but who are very crucial in things that happened, and those are Kiffy Rebo and Meredith Rogers from Ewing and George Payton Gallery, who, to my limited knowledge, were really supportive of the Women's Art Network and LIP and all of that sort of stuff, and will be able to detail that rather more than I can. And also Bernice Murphy, who was more or less responsible for the prospectors, because I remember talking with her in '79 and how she proposed to solve that problem, and the 50% problem was by, and the lack of Australian representation was by putting together the prospector for '81. So, you know.
Yeah, I mean, there's a book just published last year on Kiffy Rebo, which is a collection of essays by various people, which retrieves a lot of that history. And it's certainly the case that the Ewing and George Payton Gallery, which Kiffy was director of from the early 70s through, and where Meredith worked as her assistant, was a showcase for a great deal of experimental performance, post-object as it was called then, and a whole lot of pre-Biennale projects in a sense. And it was actually where Lucy Lippard gave her women's only talk in Melbourne, where LIP was formed actually. So yeah, it was absolutely crucial. And of course, Bernice Murphy, who was the driving force behind Perspecta, when she was working at the Art Gallery of New South Wales, before she went on to become the senior curator and then later the director of the MCA. So she played a key role through much of this period and had a great close association with various artists like Abramovich and Boyce and so on through those years.
Yeah, I mean, I must say, I sort of like, it's interesting, we need to thank you, Mami, in a way for giving us an opportunity to remind ourselves of our really rich history, because...
To remember.
Yeah, because often, yeah, but I think that often we forget, you know, and I mean, that's like, I mean, I teach, and it's part of our duty, I guess, within that role to let younger artists know. I mean, the Biennale has been a really, I think everyone would agree, an incredibly substantial part of Australia reaching out, but also people coming here. It's been a big part of a lot of our own histories. And so, you know, we're a bit short on the ground often, you know, amnesia's maybe gets practice everywhere, but I think that's what makes any culture rich, is you've got to remember it comes from something, you know. It's not just always about what's happening right now. So,
And so many works
I think it's a really excellent thing.
So many works from 70s are so challenging, risk-taking, and then also, even I see it now, it looks so exciting. I want some of them back.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Oh, don't you know the 70s was just boring and made bad art? And don't you know that?
But you know, I don't know if anybody here saw the show. Well, I saw it at PS1 of WAC, which was looking at feminist art, and that was an extraordinary experience. In the same way that you saw this work that you kind of knew obviously about, but to see it in actuality, it was still radical. It was sort of, in a way.
Did it have a big catalogue?
Yeah, huge catalogue. Yeah.
Yeah, I think
With
Biennale
Martha
used to be
Rosmer.
probably the place or opportunity where artistic director brings most newest or youngest artists from around the world. But now in the last 5 years, the climate changed a little bit, and I have complete freedom to work with the artists from any generation, and who has a power and strength to do something. And then I think some of the overlooked women artists, the senior women artists, are still so powerful, regardless of their market recognition or anything. So I'm bringing some of them back.
I thought you were going to say that. I thought you were going to say that you're free now to just concentrate on all the oldies.
But even we can do some exhibition even about artists over 70 or over 80 or something. It could make such a strong show. Sorry, maybe any more? Okay. The lady in the back.
Hi, just a quick question. What sort of impact do you think that the Australia Council might have had, or the introduction of the Australia Council in 75, I think it was, or 76, had on the women's art movement or accessibility to grants or support?
Can you comment on?
Well, I mean, while Vivienne referred to the Women's Art Register getting a grant, I mean, LIP never got a grant.
No, it was the Schools Commission.
Yeah, it was all self-funded. I mean, by doing, ridiculous things like running stores and, sausage sizzles and that kind of level. So, it was always a complaint that the Australia Council, certainly in the 70s, only funded a small elite group of artists, and much of the art workers' union campaigns through the 80s was in re-educating the Australia Council around questions of more democratic processes of funding, questions of artists' fees, contracts. So I actually think all that motivation came from the artists, not from the Australia Council. The Australia Council was pulled kicking and screaming up on these issues.
Yeah. The Australia Council formed the Community Arts Board, which had that very strong outreach into community. But, across the rest of the boards, it wasn't that strong on women. I mean, maybe the Crafts Board, because, there were more, perhaps, women. But no, it wasn't that great. It was just status quo, actually.
Maybe one more question I can take. Okay. Mel, can you put the microphone to the... Sorry. She was getting her names for the picture, no?
Sorry, I'll let you. Thank you. Tonight's been really lovely and a treat. My question is possibly a little bit uncomfortable, but about a year ago I encountered white elephant red herring in the lost archive of the Australia Council when it got discarded. And I read it with absolute delight and this kind of shock at realising that this protest movement had happened in 79. and it was particularly directly after the instances of protest around the 2014 Biennale and watching that damage happen, that I was reading that text and going like, wow, this organisation. One of the things that struck me about that was mostly the structural conditions that enabled protest to happen, which was that it appeared, and Vivienne, maybe you could speak to this a little bit, but it appeared like the artistic community knew who was within the Biennale structure and the pay grades that were kind of happening.
And the what?
Pay grade, like what the conditions of labour were for the Biennale. And my reflection on reading that was that it seemed like the structural conditions now is the thing that has been learnt is how to conceal those conditions and to keep people in the dark in order to stop protest from occurring. And I was kind of mostly curious, Mami, about what your practice or thoughts were around how to direct a Biennale ethically. And also, I guess, Vivienne, what your thoughts were in terms of the structural conditions and how they've changed.
Yeah, it's interesting. We spent a fair bit of time trying to work it out. And we spent a fair bit of time trying to work it out, and as I said, we had a lot of meetings amongst ourselves, but also with, you know, the officials, if you like, from the Biennale and so on. And I said that Franco Belgiano Nettis came to one of the meetings, and that seemed to be a really good thing, that he would take the time to come. I don't think I can really go to the nitty-gritty of your question, because I don't remember that I knew really enough about the structure, although, like, I remember right from the first Biennale, I think, was that McCulloch?
No, that was the second.
The second, yeah, well, you know, that seemed a much more homey sort of Biennale, and there seemed to be a lot more connection between, say, McCulloch and the various artists around Sydney and so on. It was interesting to be reminded that he was on a really low budget, and you know, but there was something about that answered some of the questions that we later were pushing for.
But I guess you had about, tell me if I'm wrong on this, but it was about 3 years, because at that point it was a triennial, right? And you guys were organising about 2 years before the Biennale even occurred, so there had to be awareness around.
Yeah, well, and there was, as I said, you know, there was, well, you said that the Art Workers Union, we were thinking about these things. We're definitely investigating structures of institutions and so on in the arts. So we had quite a bit of know-how, and we learned a bit more through our interactions, as I explained, with the people, and we saw that you could change things slightly, but that there was a lot of protection of, you know, keeping the power in the right places and so on, not giving too much away.
I don't think that the Biennale was more transparent. It was the pressure put on by artists through Art Workers Union. And the Art Workers Union had, you know, affirmative action committee, it had a safety and health committee, it had publications committee, and it had branches in Brisbane, Melbourne, Adelaide, and a couple of regional places too. So it was, I mean, it was the 70s.
And there was a lot of really talented people, very capable of investigating all this stuff too, you know, with Ian Byrne, Joan Grounds, you know, many people, and very committed to the task.
Yeah, I think it's happening all around the world that artists are trying to fight against something that they want to give some voices. And it's not only about here, it's not only about the 70s. Throughout the history of these artistic participation to the society, that artists had been raising their voices. And I think it's important to understand that kind of long-term commitment of artistic community in many ways, and relationship with Biennale, but also not only Biennale, but the development of the institutions. Like Alexis said, 83 Artspace opened, 91 MCA opened. So history of Biennale is also grown together with the development of the institutions too, and then also maybe system, and then also funding and all of that. So yeah, I'm just trying to understand that the bigger picture of how and where Biennale is placed, and what was the contribution or role, and within a longer history.
Well, the artist run spaces, came out of all that agitation about elitism, and and it's particularly strong in America, the agitation about the power of dealers and galleries and so on. And
yeah, because Ian had come back from New York, and he'd been, had a passing acquaintance with the Art Workers Union in New York, and their struggles around fees, contracts, representation.
Contracts, that's right. Contracts.
So yeah, they're all big, and it's quite true actually. When the Art Workers Union was set up, just outside of Central, it was the Art Workers Union who supported the creation of Artspace that was then set up there. Artspace came into being through the Art Workers Union.
Did NAVA grow out of that?
NAVA came later. NAVA was after. Yeah.
Much later, and then...
I think it's pity that we have to close the discussion soon, but it's been fantastic. Thank you very much. Thank you. And I would like to say that I'll be continuing this archive story series, and I'll come back in August and September. So Mel and I are already talking about it. So maybe some of the invitation might go to some of you. Thank you very much for coming.